Welcome to our fifth and final presentation of the year. I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the Speaker Program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight we're honoured to have Emeritus Professor David Horner presenting The War Game, Australian War Leadership from Gallipoli to Iraq. A little bit about David, for those of you who don't know, and I would doubt there's many of you. David is an Emeritus Professor in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Australian National University. He served as an infantry platoon commander in the Vietnam War, and later as a colonel was head of the Australian Army's Land Warfare Studies Centre. He's the author or editor of 37 books on Australian military history, defence and intelligence, including The Spycatchers, SAS Phantoms of War, Duty First, Blamey, and Battles That Shaped Australia. David also has a Member of Australia AM and is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Now, a little bit of process before David begins. He will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, and as we have done in recent presentations, we can do this in two ways. You can post a chat message anytime up to and including question time and address the question to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read out your question, or as often happens, a statement using your first name. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. David is happy for your screens to be on, but remember everyone can also see you, but please make sure your microphone's switched off. By now, you should be on speaker view, and I invite David to speak. Over to you, David.
Oh, goodness, no, that's what's happened here. We'll just
It's the wrong screen, I think, David.
Stop sharing and let's try again. How's that? Have you got me now?
Yes, we do.
Good.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great honour and pleasure to be invited to speak to you about my new book, The War Game, Australian War Leadership from Gallipoli to Iraq. Now, I'd like to think that my book has some current relevance with a major and tragic war currently taking place in Ukraine and strategic uncertainty and mounting threats in the Asia-Pacific region. War is a deadly serious business. So serious that during the First World War, the French Prime Minister and War Minister, Georges Clemenceau, famously declared that it was too important to be left to the generals. It might seem quixotic then, perhaps even disrespectful, of the human suffering caused by war for me to give my book about Australian war leadership the title of The War Game. In ordinary public discourse, a game is more likely to be associated with an amusing pastime, often played by children, or a sport. But warfare certainly has elements of a game. There are two, sometimes several opponents. There are rules, although these are sometimes broken. There are winners and losers, and it becomes addictive. Other writers have also recognised the paradox of comparing war to a game. The early 18th century satirist Jonathan Swift declared, "War, that mad game that the world loves to play." In his books, The Battle of the Books and Gulliver's Travels, the latter published in 1725, Swift revealed his disdain for the then traditional correlation between war games, military success, and political leadership. And writing in 1788, the English politician and man of letters, Horace Walpole, avowed that war is a game, but unfortunately the cards counters and fishers, that is the pieces, suffer by an ill run more than the gamesters. If war is so serious, it's startling to note the frequency with which Australia has gone to war. In a span of just under 90 years, from August 1914 to March 2003, Australia went to war 9 times. Further, in the century between 1914 and 2013, Australian military personnel were on active service during 47 of those years. And this from a nation, an island continent, that is largely remote from countries that might pose a major threat. Why then did Australia go to war on these 9 occasions? And why have Australian military personnel been on operations for almost half of that time? In a broad sense, the answers to these questions might be found in Australia's history as a British colony, in the nation's insecurity as a thinly populated country in a vast continent on the edge of Asia, and in the desire of a small country to seek security as part of a protective alliance. But to understand why Australia became involved in specific wars, we need to focus on the decisions of the political leaders, and in particular, the prime ministers. The gravest decision the government can make is to commit the nation to war. Other crucial decisions then follow, including determining what forces should be committed, where they should be committed, and whether they should be withdrawn. This book therefore focuses on the key players, a term also used for games, but to a lesser extent, it's also about the command and organisational structures that support the players. So who were these war leaders? My book explores the relationships between some of the most dominant political leaders in Australian history. Billy Hughes, Robert Menzies, John Curtin, Harold Holt, John Gorton, Bob Hawke, and John Howard, and their top military commanders, including William Birdwood, John Monash, Brudenell White, Thomas Blamey, Vernon Sturdy, Douglas MacArthur, Sidney Rowell, Frederick Sherger, John Wilton, Peter Gratian, and Peter Cosgrove. In calling the book The War Game, I wanted to draw attention not just to the frequency of Australia's wars, but to the constant features of how Australia has gone to war. In each war, the players have been the same. The prime ministers, their senior ministers, their military and sometimes civilian advisors, and because Australia has always fought as part of an allied coalition, the political and military leaders of Great Britain and the United States. The issues have also been constant, primarily the need to respond to the imperatives of being a member of an alliance, whether it be the British Empire or the US alliance. Further, all Australia's wars have involved commitments far from home, except in the case of the Pacific War, which began at some distance from Australia, but was soon on the nation's doorstep. In a democracy, war leadership involves the interaction between the political leaders and their top military advisors. Despite the arguments presented in books such as Samuel Huntington's 1957 classic, The Soldier and the State, there's no perfect model for civil-military relations. During the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln famously wrote to the Union Army's General Ulysses Grant, "The particulars of your plans I neither know nor seek to know. You are vigilant and self-reliant, and pleased with this, I wish not to obtrude any constraints or restraints upon you. If there is anything wanting which is within my power to give, do not fail to let me know it." Similarly, in the Second World War, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, often praised as an outstanding war leader, drove his military advisors to distraction, but in the end, he was loath to overrule them. As an activist, hands-on leader, he was keen to visit his troops on the battlefield. Much insight into war leadership is provided by the biographies of famous leaders. By one count, there are more than 60 biographies of Churchill, including Carlo d'Este's biography called Warlord, and at least 15 books on Australia's Second World War Prime Minister, John Curtin. Another insight into war leadership is found in the memoirs of key players. One example being the memoirs of Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the British War Cabinet in the First World War. He called his book The Supreme Command. There are, however, few general histories of war leadership, with most books instead taking a case study approach. In his book, Leadership in War, the British historian Andrew Roberts examines the cases of Napoleon Bonaparte, Horatio Nelson, Churchill, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, General George Marshall, Charles de Gaulle, General Dwight Eisenhower, and Margaret Thatcher. And the American historian Elliot Cohen, in his book Supreme Command, focuses on Abraham Lincoln, George Clemenceau, Churchill, and Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Cohen also discusses the relationship between President Lyndon Johnson and his chiefs of staff during the Vietnam War. And he comes to some thoughtful and instructive conclusions about the nature of war leadership. Now, the leaders I've just mentioned were principal players in their country's wars. Often they were larger than life figures, people with big egos, or at least a strong belief in their own judgment and destiny. They were required to make momentous decisions that might decide the survival of their country. By contrast, Australia's war leaders have been on a different level to these historical examples. Australia has always gone to war as part of an allied coalition. Its leaders had little scope to influence allied strategy, and their decisions were not likely to affect the outcome of the war. The main decisions of Australia's war leaders have been to decide whether Australia should go to war and the level of the commitment to the war. But in the case of both the major world figures and Australia's less Olympian war leaders, the issues of civil-military relations remain the same. And one of them is the imperative for political leaders to select military commanders in whom they have confidence and to dismiss commanders if they feel it necessary. The prime ministers discussed in my book were all civilians, and indeed only one of them, John Gorton, had even seen active service, in his case as a fighter pilot in the Second World War. Prime ministers do not naturally have any great expertise in military matters. Only one of the prime ministers had previously been a defence minister when first taking up their office. Joseph Cook, prime minister on the outbreak of the First World War, had been defence minister in 1909 and 1910, but is best remembered for his opposition to the purchase of the River-class destroyers, so-called because the ships bore the name of inland waterways, because he mistakenly thought they could only be used in rivers. Gorton was the first to admit that he was no trained strategist nor a trained tactician. The First World War Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, a lawyer, declared that he was an Attorney General, not a Major General. The Prime Ministers and their Defence Ministers therefore needed to rely on the chiefs of the armed forces for advice about the availability and capabilities of the military forces. Now, service chiefs fulfil two roles. They're the government's principal military advisors, and they have an executive role to implement the government's decisions. And it falls to them to deploy the forces efficiently, to ensure they're trained to the best possible level, and to make sure that they are employed properly to achieve the government's goals. And the military chiefs achieve this second role through the command structure. When forces are deployed overseas, they generally have a commander who reports back to the Australian government and ensures that the government's policies are followed. Hence, political leaders have a critical role in selecting their principal military advisors and commanders. War leadership therefore involves tension between the two parties, the civil and the military, who often come from different backgrounds. One is based on compromise, consensus, and public acceptance. The other is based on discipline, obedience, and clear orders. In a democracy, there's no question about who is in charge. It's the civilian political leaders. But the military leaders have the professional military expertise. At times, military leaders might find themselves being ordered to carry out directions that they believe to be against the national interest. It's often argued that in those circumstances, military leaders are left with two alternatives, either to obey the government or to resign. However, there's a contrary argument. So long as the government's direction is lawful, a military chief should not resign, because in doing so, they would enter the political sphere, which the military is not permitted to do. Lieutenant General Sir Sidney Rowell, Australia's Chief of the General Staff from 1950 to 1954, wrote in his memoirs that when faced with an unpalatable decision, a chief might consider threatening to resign. But he concluded that loose talk of threatening to resign is twaddle. To take the issue to the point of no return merely leads to the protester being replaced by someone more pliable. So let me now quickly run through my 9 wars. The first war was obviously the First World War, in which Australia had 3 war leaders. Prime Minister Joseph Cook was Prime Minister for only the first 6 weeks of the war, because he lost the general election that was being held at that time. But this was a crucial time. He did not commit Australia to the war. It was assumed that because Britain was at war, the dominions of the empire were at war also. But Cook and his government decided to raise and send the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, overseas to fight with Britain, and he appointed the AIF's first commander, Major General William Bridges. The next Prime Minister, Andrew Fisher, agreed to expand Australia's war commitment, but it was a measure of the limitations on his capacity to manage the war that the Australian government did not find out that its troops had landed at Gallipoli until a few days after the landing. His Defence Minister, George Pearce, would hold the position for the remainder of the war and beyond. After about a year as Prime Minister, Fisher handed over to Billy Hughes, who was Australia's war leader for the next 3 years. By this time, Bridges had been killed and an officer of the British Indian Army, Sir William Birdwood, had taken over as commander of the AIF. Hughes dealt with 3 crucial issues. He sought to gain an input into imperial decision-making through the Imperial War Cabinet. He conducted 2 unsuccessful referenda that introduced conscription and in so doing split the Labor Party, and he confirmed General Monash as the commander of the Australian Corps to succeed General Birdwood. Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister on the outbreak of the Second World War. He set up the War Cabinet and later the Advisory War Council to help manage the war effort. The influential Frederick Shedden was secretary of both bodies and became the government's principal advisor on strategic and defence issues, and he's seated there on Menzies' left. Menzies and his government made numerous critical decisions to place the RAN ships under British Admiralty control, to raise a second AIF for service overseas, to appoint the commander of the AIF, General Thomas Blamey, to take part in the Empire Air Training Scheme, to send the 7th Division to the Middle East, to send 2 brigades of the 8th Division to Malaya, and to commit Australian forces to the Greek campaign. Arthur Fadden succeeded Menzies as Prime Minister. But before then, as acting Prime Minister, he made several important decisions about the defence of Australia. As Prime Minister, he confirmed the Menzies government's decision to insist on the withdrawal of Australian troops from Tobruk. And back in Australia, the government was advised by the Chiefs of Staff of the three services. During 1940 and 1941, the Chief of the Air Staff was a British officer, and the British officer was Chief of Naval Staff for the entire war. But the Chief of the General Staff, General Vernon Sturdy, was an Australian, and he carried special responsibility. For the purposes of understanding Australian war leadership, the Second World War can be seen as two wars: the European War, which began in 1939, and the Pacific War, which began in December 1941. John Curtin was Prime Minister when Japan attacked in December 1941. With Australia under threat of invasion, he faced challenging tasks as war leader, and his war leadership was shared with General Douglas MacArthur, the American Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific area. This was an abrogation of Australian sovereignty, but in the emergency, there was little alternative. General Blamey, Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army, sought to ensure the government received advice from an Australian officer. Under Curtin, in October 1943, Australia restructured its war effort. Gradually, Australia's military effort was wound back, but troops were committed to fighting in New Guinea, Bougainville and Borneo to ensure Australia had a seat at the peace table. Menzies was back in the chair as Prime Minister when Australia committed forces to the Korean War in 1950, and also aircraft to the Malayan emergency in the same year. But war leadership now had a new dynamic. Australia was no longer involved in an existential war, but military forces were still serving on operations. Unlike the First and Second World Wars, the government now had some discretion as to whether Australia should be involved in the wars of the 1950s and 1960s. The whole issue of Australia's involvement became one of careful calibration. Australia supported Britain in dealing with Indonesia's confrontation with Malaysia, but the commitment to the Vietnam War was highly contentious. Now, the 9 wars I discussed in the book, Menzies took Australia into 5 of them, including Vietnam. Prime Minister Harold Holt, who succeeded Menzies in 1966, increased Australia's commitment. But his successor, John Gorton, after the short prime ministership of John McEwen, had to deal with the problem of how to withdraw from Vietnam. And this was eventually achieved under the prime ministership of William McMahon. The Vietnam War had many lessons for the process of war leadership. In the Second World War, Menzies established a war cabinet. For the Vietnam War and the Indonesian confrontation, he followed a similar practice and established a Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee of Cabinet. The Menzies government was not keen to hear from its foreign policy advisors about whether it was wise to contribute to the war. At the same time, its senior military advisors, Air Chief Marshal Sir Frederick Schurger and General Sir John Wilton, were keen for Australia to make the commitment. Whereas in the past, military advice had been provided by the Chiefs of Staff of the services, now there was a separate chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. But the service chiefs still had a major role in providing advice. The next war leader was Prime Minister Bob Hawke in the 1990-1991 Gulf War. Hawke did not establish a formal cabinet committee, but a small group of ministers approved the commitment to the Maritime Interception Force in August 1990 and the commitment to the Gulf War in February 1991. This was the first war for the Australian Defence Force. Military advice was now provided by the Chief of the Defence Force, in this case, General Peter Gratian. John Howard was Prime Minister for the commitment to the war in Afghanistan in 2001 and to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Howard had a finely developed mechanism for managing these two commitments. He had a National Security Committee of Cabinet and received his advice from the Chief of the Defence Force, General Peter Cosgrove. The Australian Defence Force had a new command structure whereby military operations were under the direct control of a Commander of Joint Operations. In my view, the management of Australia's commitment to the invasion of Iraq was handled quite brilliantly. However, Howard never sought contrary advice from anywhere in the bureaucracy. And this leaves open the important question as to whether the commitment was wise and could be justified, even though it might well have been managed very well. Now, an interesting issue is the extent to which political leaders should become involved in the conduct of operations. They need to appoint commanders in whom they have confidence, but ultimately the political leaders are responsible to ensure that the operations achieve what the government intended. Many political leaders believe they needed to visit the troops in the field, both to gain an understanding of the conditions in which the troops were operating and to demonstrate their personal responsibility. Hence, Billy Hughes visited the Western Front in 1916 and in 1918, emphasising to Monash in September 1918 that the troops needed to be given a break from operations. Menzies visited the troops in Libya in February 1941, towards the end of their successful campaign. But Curtin never visited soldiers in the field, even in Australia, let alone on operations. And Menzies failed to visit South Korea, although his senior ministers did. Menzies briefly visited units in Malaya towards the end of the Malayan emergency. Harold Holt, John Gorton made a visit to the troops in South Vietnam a high priority early in their prime ministership. Holt also visited the troops on operations in Borneo. Considering the nature of Australia's commitment to the 1991 Gulf War, it was not easy for Holt to visit the ships, but Defence Minister Robert Ray did. John Howard visited the troops in the Gulf region as soon as the invasion of Iraq was completed. For a century then, Australia's leaders have been engaged in the war game. And just as a game has rules, there are fundamental rules for effective war leadership. And the first rule is that the war leader's most important decision is whether to commit the nation to war. And in his book, The Commanders, about decision-making during the 1991 Gulf War, the decorated American journalist Bob Woodward wrote, "The decision to go to war is one that defines a nation, both to the world and perhaps more importantly, to itself. There is no more serious business for a national government, no more accurate measure of national leadership." In the First World War, and for a certain extent in the Second World War, this decision was taken out of the hands of the Australian government. In the midst of the Second World War, the Menzies government had to decide whether to approve the campaign in Greece. But the decisions to commit forces to the subsequent wars from Korea to Iraq became increasingly controversial, raising questions about the process and whether legislation should be introduced to ensure that these decisions are taken by the Parliament rather than the executive government. What is clear is that the outcome is likely to lead to unintended consequences. The second rule for war leaders is to determine the level and nature of the commitment. In the First World War, this decision was actually taken before the formal outbreak of the war. The Menzies government was more cautious about this in 1939. The decisions in the Vietnam War were made incrementally, but during all the wars from Korea to Iraq, the Australian government tried to keep the commitment as small as possible while reaping the benefits of being seen to support the alliances with Britain and the United States. The third rule is that war leaders are not the source of all wisdom. Obviously, expert military advice is important, but so too is the advice of senior ministers with their specific responsibilities. In the First World War, the cabinet was relatively small and the Australian Prime Minister did not establish a war cabinet. By contrast, at the beginning of the Second World War, Menzies established a war cabinet of which the service chiefs were regularly invited. The Advisory War Council, formed for political reasons, became a source of further advice. Curtin's Prime Minister's War Conference was formed because of the special position of General Douglas MacArthur. When Menzies formed the National Security Resources Board in 1950, he was building on the Second World War experience. More importantly, in 1963, he established the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee of Cabinet in the lead up to the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, Gorton disregarded the FAD committee to the detriment of good policy making. Hawke did not have a formal committee, but used an informal group of ministers, and the Howard government had a National Security Committee of Cabinet. Governments have always established formal structures for the provision of military advice. In the First World War, and these structures included the Defence Council, which is rarely used, and the naval and military boards. In the Second World War through to the Vietnam War, advice was provided by the Defence Committee, generally the service chiefs and senior public servants, and the Chiefs of Staff Committee. By the time of the Gulf War, military advice had been focused more closely in the person of the CDF, although he was advised by the augmented Chiefs of Staff Committee. This arrangement continued to evolve, and by 2001, the National Security Committee was advised by the Secretary's Committee on National Security, although the CDF still had a prime role as military advisor. The important role of advisors leads to the fourth rule for war leaders, namely the imperative to select military commanders in whom the government has confidence. These include not only the service chiefs, who become the government's principal military advisors, but also the commanders of the deployed forces, who are responsible for ensuring that the forces are employed in accordance with the government's policy. In the First World War, General Birdwood, an officer of the British Indian Army, selected himself to command the AIF, although the Prime Minister, Hughes, was involved in the later decision to retain Monash as commander of the Australian Corps. In the Second World War, the government selected several British officers as service chiefs, but made a major decision in appointing Blamey to command the second AIF. And from 1942 to 1945, the government's principal military advisor was an American general, Douglas MacArthur. In the Vietnam War, the government gave much consideration to the appointment of the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, but was not closely involved in selecting successive commanders of the Australian Force Vietnam. In later wars, the commanders in the field were largely selected by the service chiefs and approved by the Defence Minister. In the Gulf War, Admiral Doolan commanded the naval forces by virtue of his role as maritime commander. The fifth rule is to ensure that the operations are conducted in accordance with the government's policy. There's one view that the government should give the military its orders and allow them to carry them out. But there is another view that the political leaders need to take a more hands-on approach. In 1918, Prime Minister Billy Hughes intervened to ensure that troops were given leave or rest from operations. In 1945, the acting Minister for the Army, Senator James Fraser, visited the operational areas in New Guinea and Bougainville to check on possible equipment shortages. In Vietnam, the government largely left the conduct of operations in the hands of the military commanders until Malcolm Fraser, as Defence Minister, took a more active approach. It is, of course, the field commander's prime responsibility to ensure that operations are in accordance with Australia's best interests. And for that reason, Blamey fought with the government's support to withdraw his troops from Tobruk. And on Blamey's advice, the Curtin government stopped the 6th Division taking part in the invasion of Java. Wilton was keenly aware of this responsibility during the Vietnam War. In the invasion of Iraq, Brigadier McNahon prevented the RAAF Hornets from conducting certain missions that were not in accordance with government policy. A fundamental of effective war leadership is ensuring that the government's wishes are followed on the battlefield. The 6th rule is the importance of trying to gain access to Allied strategic decision-making. It took until 1918 before Hughes fully appreciated this requirement. Menzies and Curtin struggled with this issue in the Second World War, and it persisted in later wars. In the invasion of Iraq, the Australians detected that the plans for the subsequent post-invasion phase were deficient, but were unable to change them. The lesson for Australia is to remain constantly vigilant, and a prime task for war leaders is to manage Australia's role in the alliance. The 7th rule is the need to deal with the political arena. An effective war leader must manage the politics successfully. Hughes split his own party over conscription, believing it was necessary to achieve the government's war aims. With the assistance of John Curtin, Menzies introduced the Advisory War Council, which largely nullified the threat from the opposition. But nonetheless, he failed to manage the politics of his own party in 1941. It's just as important to deal with politics within the party as to deal with the opposition. And Hawke understood this, as he sought to deal with the critics within his party before the Gulf War. Howard managed the coalition's politicians superbly and gave the opposition little capacity to manoeuvre in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. The 8th rule is to ensure that the country has its own intelligence gathering capacity. A fundamental requirement for good decision-making is information and intelligence. In the First World War, Australia had little ability to make its own judgments about the world situation. In the Second World War, Australia started to develop its own diplomatic services and appointed representatives to several countries, including Japan and the United States. Australia also started to establish its own strategic intelligence gathering capabilities, but these were limited. In the Vietnam War, the government was not made aware of or ignored American reports indicating that the Allies were unlikely to prevent a communist victory. Before the Iraq War, Australia's intelligence agencies made assessments that appeared at variance with those of their allies. So the lesson is not just the need to have effective diplomatic and intelligence agencies, but also for the government to listen to them. The Australian Defence official Rod Barton, who was at the coalface of intelligence collection in Iraq, wrote, "One thing my intelligence career has taught me is that, with a few exceptions, politicians only take professional advice when it supports their policies, and even then, only pick the bits that suit them." The 9th rule is the need to manage the media. Hughes did this through the ruthless use of regulations to ban newspapers. Menzies appointed a Director General of Information, Sir Keith Murdoch, father of Rupert. But Curtin ran up against the restrictions General MacArthur imposed on the release of information. Hawke and Howard gave much attention to the management of media during the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. And the final and 10th rule is that war leadership will always take place in an environment of uncertainty. Intelligence assessments can usually determine an enemy's or potential enemy's capabilities, but they're less certain about actual intentions. The Australian government spent much effort from September 1939 to late 1941 trying to discern Japan's intentions. Many of the government's decisions about forced deployments in the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s were made against the uncertainty of how the strategic situation was going to develop in Southeast Asia. Now, it's all very well to develop lists of rules. It's another thing to ensure that prime ministers even think about these issues until they're presented with the situation. Field Marshal Sir William Robertson, the CIGS in 1916, until he was forced to resign after a dispute with Prime Minister Lloyd George in February 1918, commented that in all trades and professions, the man who aims at taking the lead knows that he must first learn the business he purposes to follow. Only in the business of war, the most difficult of all, is no special training or study demanded from those charged and paid for its management. If a National Security Committee of Cabinet exists in peacetime and with the military advisors present deals frequently with security and defence issues, its members are likely to develop some understanding of problems likely to be faced in a deteriorating strategic situation. It would be even better if the political leaders had some understanding of how their predecessors handled these issues in the past. Australia's experience of war leadership over more than a century provides a resource and a guide for developing an understanding of how the nation and its leaders might face future challenges. Many of the lessons drawn from the past century are still relevant today. The failure of the United States in Iraq, brought out in Thomas Rick's book, Fiasco, should lead to at least two vital conclusions. That the US process for going to war was deeply flawed, and Australia would be wise to treat any US plan for war with deep suspicion, and Australia should not smugly assume that it might not display the same faulty process in the future. Few countries celebrate their military history with as much enthusiasm as Australia. Most Australians possess at least a vague knowledge of the landing at Gallipoli in 1915 and the fighting on the Kokoda Trail in 1942. The personal experience of war continues to hold a fascination. But the big challenge is to understand why Australia was involved in its wars and how the Australian government went about managing them. Ultimately, these decisions are about war strategy. Now, this might seem to be an esoteric matter, but if governments get the strategy wrong, the cost is borne by the soldiers on the battlefield, their families, the nation's treasury, and its reputation. So war leadership continues to be the crucial factor in considering Australia's experience of war. As Horace Walpole reminds us, in the game of war, the lives of the nation's sailors, soldiers, and airmen and women are in the hands of the gamesters, that is, the political leaders and their advisors. Thank you very much, and we'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, David. Is your slideshow? Yes, could you turn off your slideshow now, David?
Yep, how about that?
Perfect.
Right.
You'll be looking much enlarged. Now I'll ask David questions via the ones submitted via chat first, if there are any. Let me check. Yes, there is one. Oop, how do I get that? There we go. One from Marcus. David, thank you for your presentation. I look forward to reading your book. Based on your research, do you support the calls for a parliamentary process to approve the deployment of Australian troops of war, to war? And if so, do you see that? How do you see that process occurring?
Yes, I have concluded that Parliament should be involved, except that you can imagine a case of an emergency in which they should not be involved. I mean, obviously, if suddenly the country finds itself under attack, well, then the government has to react immediately. But all the wars that Australia has been involved in since the Second World War, an extra day or so of decision-making would not have been crucial, except perhaps for political reasons. For example, in the Korean War, the government wanted to make the decision, so they got their decision out there before the British got their decision out. And Hawke and Howard were aware of this, and so they did allow a debate in Parliament about whether we should have gone to the Gulf War or to the invasion of Iraq. The only problem was that they had the debate after the commitment had already been made. And by the time the decision was voted on in Parliament and passed for the invasion of Iraq, the fighting had already begun. So I can see no reason why those decisions could not have been debated in Parliament beforehand, given that in each case, the case of Hawke and the case of Howard, when they were debated, that they were passed. So I mean, I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not sure. I haven't thought my way through the full process. But some other countries do require decisions to go to war to be made by their parliaments. The United States and Canada in certain circumstances are examples. So I have some years ago I would not have said that, but having written the book, I now conclude that perhaps the vote should go to Parliament.
Okay. From David, not you, David, another David. David, in your analysis of our experiences, was there a common theme?
Well, I did refer to a couple of common themes, but I will go a bit further on a common theme that has appeared since midway through the Second World War. I mentioned briefly in October 1943, the government made the decision to contract our war effort slightly, but continue to fight in New Guinea, Bougainville, New Britain, Borneo. Before that time, we had fought to try to help win the war, or in the case of fighting in New Guinea, to defend Australia. From that time onwards, if we had never been involved in fighting from October 1943 onwards through to the present day, if we had not gone to war, it would not have made any decision to the outcome of the war. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the commitments were wrong. It means to say that they were made for a different reason. They were made for political reasons, to gain some kudos within the alliance. Perhaps that's worth doing. But nonetheless, I'm trying to make the point that from there on, it's different. And I remember one journalist writing that Australian strategic policy since that time has been one of ruthless cynicism. That is, to try and keep the forces as small as possible, but still gain some benefit from being part of the alliance. So if we're looking for some common themes, there's a common theme of Australia going to war for the past 70 years.
Okay, thank you. Tony Hastings says, to what degree did the Australian government critically analyse American intelligence before committing to Iraq in 2003?
One of the problems I had in writing this book was to write the last chapter, because unlike all the other chapters, I had access to the records. And I didn't have access to the records for the invasion of Iraq. So I'm not in a position to say how much they critically analysed American intelligence. But a couple of inquiries were conducted in Australia, and they did indicate that the Australian intelligence organisations had a different view to those of the American ones. And there were differences between, say, the Defence Intelligence Organisation and the Office of National Assessment. So I'm not in a position to say how much they critically analysed the American, and for that matter, the British intelligence. But we do know that Howard was very much taken by the intelligence that was given to him by the Americans and by the British. He went to Britain where head of MI6 and head of their Signals Intelligence Organisation gave him briefings. I don't know exactly what the intelligence was that he was receiving from DIO, but from little we get from those two inquiries that were done in Australia, it would seem that the intelligence was different from the intelligence being provided to us from our allies.
Okay, thanks. A comment mainly from Marcus. Thanks, David. The US system requires congressional approval by law, but by practice, POTUS makes the decision to commit usually on the imperative of time, and Congress can only then control ongoing funding. So the US model is no longer effective in practice. Food for thought. What happens if the decision is not passed?
Well, I just when you're talking about what happens if the decision is not passed, I noticed a comment recently when the matter was raised in Australia, and the government said that that we couldn't allow the Parliament to make a decision because the Parliament might make the wrong decision. Well, I thought that's what we had parliaments for, if the people of Australia through the Parliament come to a decision, surely that should be the binding decision on the government.
So yes, okay. Mark Dunn asks, IMHO, I'm not sure what that acronym is. Often it suits the political agenda to promote uncertainty in an electorate. Does this lead to a predisposition to go to war?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. We're now moving into a slightly different situation where in each of the wars that we've been involved in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been discussion in the press about the deteriorating strategic situation, and certainly we got Howard managed this very well in the 2 years before we went into Iraq. There was the constant talking to the press about the bad situation that we're facing, and so he was setting the scene for us to take part in the invasion of Iraq. Whether that leads to a predisposition to go to war or not, or whether it's being driven the other way, whether he's making the predisposition, I don't know. But it's a matter really worth thinking about.
Thank you for that. Mark Dunn just clarified about IMHO, which probably everyone knew, but me means in my humble opinion.
Well, it's news to me too.
So do we have any more questions? Are you nodding there, Marcus? We've got another question? Yes. Oh, this is a long one. This is an essay. Okay. As a veteran of Iraq, despite all the armchair international lawyers who claim the invasion was illegal, in inverted commas, there was no issue in my mind, or dozens of Iraqis I dealt with, that Saddam was not a good person and deserved to be taken out, much like North Korea's current dictators. I know you're a critic of the 2003 war decision, David, but the broader context has to be taken into account. We might agree to disagree.
Yeah, look, yeah, okay, Marcus, we might agree to disagree, but I would say that Al Palazzo, who until recently worked in the army as a historian and a very good one, came to an interesting conclusion about the invasion of Iraq. And his conclusion was that it was highly successful from Australia's point of view, because we had no casualties in the invasion, and we strengthened the alliance. So one can talk about, you know, how you judge these things, on what plane you judge them. The problem with Iraq and Afghanistan is that they then turned into something that went on for year after year after year. And I talked in, just briefly, I mentioned you know, going to war can lead to unintended consequences. Remembering that when we went to Afghanistan, it was supported by both sides of Parliament, and when the government changed, it continued to be supported and was supported by the community at the beginning. But then it went on year after year after year. So, as I say, quite often there are unintended consequences.
Thank you. Are you writing again, Marcus? Is that no or yes? Oh, yes, you are.
I think Marcus is resting on his arms.
No. Al's conclusion was with regard to our contribution to the war rather than an invasion. I'm not sure it was necessarily helpful to the alliance, i.e. we reckoned we got the kudos for little cost. The US didn't think that was very genuine. So they saw through us, apparently, David.
This is interesting to talk about invasion. Just let me throw in a couple of thoughts about invasion, because I do have a thought about invasion that sort of irritates me. Some people are saying that at Gallipoli we invaded Turkey. Yes, we invaded Turkey just the same way as the Allies invaded at Normandy, but that's in the context of a landing in a war that is already underway. But if you take the other view of invading, that is invading a country that you have not previously been at war with, it's interesting that Australia has been involved in a couple of these. One of them is in Iraq, and the other one nearby was the invasion of Syria in 1941. You know, just a couple of throwaway thoughts.
Okay, well,
But I please a comparison between the invasion of Turkey and invasion of Normandy. What I was getting at there was in each case, there was the war was already underway. We were already at war with Turkey, and therefore landing at Gallipoli was part of the larger manoeuvring, call it that, of the war. There is the difference between Turkey and Normandy, and that we were seeking to liberate France. We're not seeking to liberate Turkey. What I was referring to, that in each case, it was a manoeuvre within the larger war, rather than an invasion of a country that we had not previously been at war with. And Australia's been involved in lots of the first sort of invasions, such as the landing in New Guinea in 1943, or the landing in Borneo in 1945, if you call those invasions. But they're different from what I'm referring to as the invasion of a country that you've not previously been at war with, such as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, or for that matter, Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year.
Okay, we've got the issue of invasions and whatever the alternative is. It's causing a little bit of discussion here over on the.
We're looking here about the rules for exit strategies.
No, it's further up. We've had a couple about clarify the comparison between invasion of Turkey and Normandy. I thought that was done.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And a follow-up one about how does that take away from the fact it was an invasion? We're sort of getting down to a bit of semantics here. What about our next issue, Taiwan? Asked David. I'm not sure quite what about Taiwan, whether we're going to invade or whether we're going to go in with someone else.
Yeah, look, I don't think we should sort of try and get down that track in the sense of what I'm talking about is Australian war leadership, unless we want to talk about whether we go to fight in Taiwan, which is another matter. But I'm not sure that we should keep on about that one.
Okay. Tony Hastings said, you've outlined the rules for committing to war. What about the rules for exit strategies?
I didn't so much say rules for committing to war. There are rules for war leadership, the broader picture of war leadership. The first part of it is committing to war, but there's also the managing, and I said this several times, the managing of the war once it's underway. Do you increase the commitment? And then I referred to the problems faced by Gorton and McMahon to withdraw from Vietnam. So it's part of war leadership, which has those ingredients I referred to, of having access to Allied strategic decision-making. After all, that was a problem we had in Vietnam of not being told by the Americans that they were planning to withdraw. The problems of intelligence, of knowing what's going on, the problems I mentioned of political leaders keeping a grip on what's going on in the war. And I mentioned the philosophy, but one philosophy being that you give it to the military officer to go off and do it. The other one is that the war leader ultimately has a responsibility of ensuring that it is going according to government policy. So that's all war leadership. And the next step is getting out of that war. How do you withdraw the forces? And that is another aspect of war leadership. So it's not rules for exit strategy. Exit strategy is one of the problems faced by the war leader. And if he has a good mechanism, it's going to make it easier to do the exit than otherwise.
Jason, you've got a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question, David. Do you think after the development of institutions such as the Staff College and the general study of warfare and the logistics of warfare after the Second World War has produced greater leadership?
What it has done is that it has produced senior military officers who are in a much better position to provide advice to the government than before. Now, that's not to say that some of the people we had before were not wise people, but we now have a much larger body of officers who are across higher level strategic and defence issues. And they're available to provide advice to the government. But it still leaves open the question as whether the government's going to listen to advice or wants advice. But what it does do is that some of the activities that we've been involved in have been managed very well because the military is good at managing these things. But the ultimate point, though, is that the decision is made by the government, not by the senior military people. Certainly, the senior military officers are now far better equipped to deal with broad strategic issues than they were way back before we even had a staff college.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. I don't think I'll go there with Taiwan. So I think, thank you very much, David, and I'll draw the questions to an end. Some very interesting questions. Thank you very much for your great presentation. And like to remind everyone that David has a book for sale, and we'll be sending out details along with our survey. And now, David, will be, as I alluded when we talked earlier, we'll be carrying on with MHHV business. If you want to remain with us, that's all fine, but
I'll say goodbye.
Feel free to
And
leave.
very, very glad to have had the chance of speaking to you this evening. See you.
Thank you very much, David. It's been appreciated. Right, just a few other things. We'll be sending out a 3-minute survey as usual. Thanks to everyone who filled out the last survey, and please do it again. It's very helpful for our planning and quality control. Our next speaker will be on next year, February the 22nd at 7:30 on Zoom. It'll be Michael Veitch discussing his latest book on Coast Watchers titled Australia's Secret Army. And I'd like to remind you that our one-day conference, The Bloody Beachheads, the Battles of Gona, Buna and Sanananda, will be on Saturday the 12th of November this year to coincide with the 80th anniversaries of those battles. The venue is going to be at East Malvern RSL, Stanley Groves Drive, Malvern East. And look for information and registration on the website. And this brings the evening session to a close. Thanks again to David. Thanks to Jason, who keeps us going behind the scenes, and thank you for joining us. We hope you come again. So good night to you from the committee and myself, and wish you all a happy and safe holiday season.